Hey, how we doing out there, guys? So, welcome back to another episode of the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. So, it is currently Wednesday, June 8th at approximately 1845. We'll talk about the Russian operations in Ukraine, a little bit of an update. So, taking a couple weeks off of that because there's been a lot of small positional changes and a lot of like small but very consequential things happening. But for most people listening to it, it pretty much would have sounded like every day would have sounded the same, only with 30 seconds that were different. Hey, this village got taken over by this person. So I kind of didn't want to just keep talking and basically saying the same things over and over on that. So there was kind of a little bit of updated information now. So I figured it'd be a good time to chat about it. So, what we're still kind of, talking about with the operations in Ukraine is so obviously the Russians they've shifted their main effort to eastern Ukraine, i.e., Luhansk, Donetsk, and the separatist sections there, the Donbass. Still secondary efforts around Kharkov, secondary efforts around Kherson, kind of around the lower Dnieper River there. And so if we kind of some of the bigger developments. So there's been this kind of cauldron, this pocket sort of brewing here, centered on this is Severodonetsk here. And then this is kind of Izium over here, and I'll flash out to this. You got like Izium and Liman and Severodonetsk here, and then this is like Bakhmut here. And so obviously this has been kind of been fought over for a while, and so the Russians have been making a lot of kind of incremental progress. So as I've talked about in pretty much all of my other videos, and then in other unrelated videos I've done going back for years, is that like kind of a thing to talk about is the I kind of brought up that what we're seeing in the war in Ukraine is basically kind of a repeat of the Winter War of 39-40 when the Russians, the Soviets, invaded Finland. And so, like I talked about before, so what they did is they kind of tried to be fancy and have multiple different axes. They tried to go across the Karelian Isthmus, which is sort of the area direct, like the closest route. But then they also sent armored units and things way up in the north, like up towards like Murmansk and towards the Petsamo region of Finland and things like that. And basically, they kind of just got made made into fools for a while. The Finns were very adept at operating in the winter and in the deep woods and the lakes and things around there. There's not a lot of roads, and the Russians, they basically weren't prepared for any of that from a logistical standpoint, from a command and control standpoint, from an equipment standpoint. So finally, at some point, they just basically said, okay, we're just going to concentrate all of our stuff pretty much in the Karelian Isthmus, and we're just going to get rid of the subtle tactics, and we're just going to launch artillery and stuff, ram takes into it, kill a bunch of our guys, but kill some of theirs until we get what we want. And that's basically what they did. And so what we're kind of seeing is the Russians basically returning to that in Ukraine. And so what they've been basically doing in the east is just large scale bombardments, with artillery, rocket artillery, air power, things like that. And they're essentially just destroying villages and towns and cities and things like that, and then moving into the rubble and taking over it afterwards. And so, which for them is, it's effective from the standpoint of being able to advance, and I guess you could say deny such areas to the Ukrainians. And it is working as far as getting them, gaining them territory. But what it also means is that one, that takes a long time, takes a lot of logistics and things like that. It also means that you're pretty much entirely moving your troops into wasted countryside as far as, buildings being destroyed and made into rubble, things like that. Obviously, if you had any hope of, kind of getting a populace onto your side, you start to lose that when you're just indiscriminately destroying all sorts of things. And, so now we'll kind of, so I use this map. So again, I like the Institute of Study of War maps because they're pretty good, but they're hard to they're good from a very general standpoint, but it's kind of hard to tell like roads and things like that. So I kind of went and drew the rough outline of a line on a Google map here as well. So we kind of see what we're working with the cauldron here. We'll flash over to our Google map. So what we're working with here is the Russian line kind of around Kharkov here. So the Russians we talked about is they never controlled all of Kharkov, but they got kind of kicked out of the outskirts as well. And so now they kind of control a little bit of the outsides, and they do have control of this, what is this major highway MO3 here that runs down towards Izium and stuff. But the Ukrainians have been launching some kind of incremental counterattacks and pushed them away. They can bring this highway corridor system under fire, but they can't yet assault it. So what you have for the Ukrainians is their ground lines of communication run through like Vovshansk, down through these villages here, and basically they run in this direction down here, and that's how kind of running through this area. You can see these highway systems. That's how they're supplying from a north-south access the stuff in the east here, which is why if the Ukrainians are able to being able to kind of try to slice into this backfield, so to speak, here to use football terminology, would be beneficial to them because, like we've talked about before, is the main hubs that kind of serve this area. Belgorod is the primary one, but if you don't have Belgorod, you have to go all the way to Voronezh, and then to kind of get back to the major highway and rail systems that would be able to hook you back up. Which is why it's also so important, why the Ukrainians have been trying to maintain this pocket for as long as possible, and why the Soviets, that's a good one, Lane, why the Russians have been trying to reduce it is because if we look at, we take it in reverse. So we look at the Ukrainians' line of supply and their lines of communication. And so coming out of Dnipro City here and stuff, so they have a couple major, highway systems here and here that the Russians have not yet been able to sever. So they're still able to kind of supply elements in here. However, with the Russians, kind of driving. So obviously, coming out of, so this is Lyman here, in this town, this village right here, and then this is Izium, kind of up at this other juncture right here. So you guys who've been following this have probably heard a lot of this, and so why this is important because obviously it sits on this kind of convergence of roads and controls this area. So there's been a lot of fighting over this, but also if the Russians could then kind of slice into this area here, and it's why they've been attacking a lot towards Sloviansk and here and things like that. They would basically sever not only the primary supply system to this pocket, but like I've talked about before, is one thing that you also have to keep in mind is that while yes, you can use smaller roads and sub roads to an extent, it's not the way that you really like supply major major operations, but what it also means is that this is the easiest way for you to advance and be able to maneuver your units around. So let's say you have, and I killed my freaking thing there, but so you've got your units here around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk here and stuff like that. But if you needed to, pull them back or to maneuver them around, you need to get back into places like Bakhmut, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, where you can then get them onto other road systems to send them down. So if you were to control these now, you don't really have ways to move around large forces, or at least not in very good ways. They're having to go cross country. There's lots of in Ukraine trains very flat for the most part, but there are a lot of woods and things like that that would inhibit you. So controlling those is big. And so I've got the terrain map as opposed to the satellite map pulled up here so we can see. So like I said, there's been a lot of fighting around Severodonetsk, and the Russians control the majority of the city. The Ukrainians did do some successful counterattacks and took back some more parts of it. I know the Georgian Legion has been fighting against the Russians there and stuff like that. But if you kind of see why the Ukrainians have been able to kind of hold the very tip of this salient, this pocket, is so this is kind of an area of high ground here in Lysychansk, which kind of almost makes an escarpment, I guess you could call it here. And so they've been able to put artillery and been able to, really kind of, give a lot of effective artillery indirect fire into the Russians. And one thing that they did is while they were occupying most of the city and the Russians kind of began shelling it, destroying it, moved in force, the Ukrainians basically pulled back, and whether intentional or not, they essentially sucked the Russians into the city, thinking that they had, scored a major, victory in moving the Ukrainians out. But then when they pulled them into the city, they basically brought them into, pre-designated fires and easy range of artillery and things like that. And so apparently the Chechens fighting for the Russians got just ripped apart very substantially in, Severodonetsk there. So that's still being fought over. And obviously this also sits on the Seversky Donetsk River, which is why this has been such a point of contention here. So I follow a few Ukrainian and Russian Telegram channels, and I try to go and watch other especially Ukrainian guys, YouTube channels and things, people who are probably actually in contact with people that live in Ukraine still or themselves live in Ukraine, so they can kind of give a little bit of insight. And so it appears that the Ukrainians are probably going to pull out of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk proper just because of the exposed nature of it, which would be a from a territory standpoint, would be a major blow because basically this is the only part of the Luhansk Oblast here, which is this area here, that they still control. So if they pull out of Lysychansk, they basically all of Donetsk and all of Luhansk basically belongs to the Russians. So the Ukrainians still they do still control a little bit of Donetsk Oblast. So obviously, kind of this area here, and then kind of from Kramatorsk. Whoops, the Russians control Donetsk itself, but then they kind of so they kind of control down to here and kind of this last little section there. But that would more or less like almost give the Russians complete control over the actual separatist oblasts, which is definitely what their primary goal of the war was. We think obviously we have some ideas about their other ones, and you also kind of think back. So it's like I said, is if and when the Ukrainians do pull out of Severodonetsk, basically the only thing that makes sense for them to pull back to would be all the way back towards Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and things like that. Because like we said, the Russians are in Izium and Lyman. They're down around Horlivka, so they're assaulting this area, trying to get into to Bakhmut and all this stuff over here as well. And so so for them it wouldn't make sense to to pull yourself out of the cauldron, which kind of runs through here and here, to pull yourself out of the cauldron, only to still keep yourself caught in the cauldron and also not in a particularly good defensive situation. But now if you do surrender basically the Seversky Donetsk River, pulling back to a line that you would kind of defend on a line that we would call basically like Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Pokrovsk would be something that they could probably manage when it comes down to that. So we'll kind of see how that plays out. Obviously, the Ukrainians are making a big deal. America promised them a fair number of MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, and also the HIMARS system. So the HIMARS is another MLRS as far as being a multiple launch rocket system. However, it's extremely long range, very long range, like several hundred kilometers, so a couple 100-mile range, which would be. Depending on how they use it, could be very effective. One, obviously, it would put parts of the battlefield within range that are not currently in range. So being able to assault, clusters of enemy, vehicles, logistics, being able to assault their supply train would be huge. But then it also opens up the possibility of, trying to assault, other things that they can't currently assault. So apparently one of the stipulations America put on with it, which is probably, smart from a, wring your hands kind of way, is that they were not allowed to use it to attack targets within Russia itself. So targets that would make a lot of sense. So if we're talking, like 500, kilometers, so you're talking something like, 300 miles, so 300 to 500 kilometers, so you're talking, like 200 to 300 miles of range, which would be substantial, which would mean that you could kind of assault this entire land bridge area from the areas that they still control. I don't know that it would give them the range to be able to actually assault the road that connects the Kerch Peninsula here to Crimea, but that if they were able to attack that would be huge, because obviously that would leave these units that are in Crimea and up around Kherson in a very precarious position. And so we'll kind of see what they decide to do with that. Obviously, like, we're not sending them like a ton of, systems, like, an unbelievable amount. I want to say it was something like 30 systems or something like that. Just off the top of my head. If that's wrong, someone correct me. Which is a big deal. But then the other thing, too, is you have to be careful if you're Ukrainians about getting something like that and then wanting to use it to do everything. And obviously, once it gets in country and starts being used, the Russians are going to be hunting for that with not only their air power and drones, but also, their ballistic missiles and things like that, cruise missiles and things they're able to assault with it. So it's going to be a target of extreme opportunity if the Russians are able to find it. So, but it definitely can alter the course of this in a significant way. So kind of keep moving a little bit to the south and to the west over here. So we know that the Ukrainians took back Mykolaiv, and they've been moving onto the and fighting up against, Kherson. So like we said, Kherson sits like on the actual lower Dnieper here. And so for them controlling Kherson, there's only a couple ways across the river right here, if you look at it. So you have this bridge that kind of comes right through Kherson itself, and then you have this one that comes through this, kind of suburb of Nova Kakhovka here. So that's the only way that they can support being on this side of the Dnieper River. So if the Ukrainians are able to, kind of move against them or to assault these bridges, they'll be able to put that in severe distress. And so what seems to have been their tactic, their strategy thus far, which is probably smart, is so given that the Russians' main effort is in the east, in Donetsk and Luhansk, but they still obviously have to maintain their elements over here. So the Ukrainians have been counterattacking and putting good pressure on them. We'll flash back over here. Whoops. In this area, obviously between Mykolaiv and Kherson, and this is where Nikopol is and places like that. They've been putting good pressure and launching kind of some consistent local or operational level counterattacks, making the Russians have to commit enough units there to to help weaken them elsewhere. And apparently there's been a major kind of reshifting and a cycling of units. So they've actually pulled back. They were closer up to Zaporizhia here. So we kind of pull back. So the Russians control to about up here. Apparently they've done a fairly substantial shift and moved more units back towards Melitopol, which kind of indicates one, it's probably some sort of rotation, rest, and refit, but it also kind of indicates that they are getting a little bit stretched out and a little bit exhausted, pushing up towards that, and they're probably trying to come back and consolidate a little bit. And so then the other thing the Russians have been starting to do is they're implementing various kinds of integration programs for the areas that they control. So flashback over here again. There we go. So as far as like forcing farmers to sell grain in rubles, they offered things like automatic Russian citizenship for people who apply for it in these areas. Apparently in like Melitopol and a couple other places, the Russians have, they basically implemented a policy where their troops were allowed to attack any vehicle they desired for any reason, and very freehand with civilians. So obviously, that's trying to limit, Ukrainian mobility as far as partisan activities and things go, and also basically setting it up so that they're the only people that can control travel and movement, and also utilities and things like that, to make the Ukrainians that are there more dependent on them to kind of integrate them. Because if you're playing the long game, a lot of people will resist hard for some amount of time, but you start to get into month 6, year 1, year 2 of this, and a lot of people kind of just don't want to be bothered anymore, to deal with this, and so they'll probably kind of submit to things like that. It's kind of typical, but you do see down around here. So like I said, so this is the Melitopol area, and there's substantial partisan activity. So if we kind of flash back to our map here, what that actually represents is this area here. And so, like I said, that kind of coincides with them doing a noticeable, reshuffling and pulling back of units towards Melitopol that were more extended here. Probably because they're just having, transportation, or what's the correct word? So mobility and issues as far as being able to, kind of move freely if they're dealing with partisan activity there. So, interesting, times. So if the Ukrainians do pull out of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, that's going to basically remove this cauldron right here. So this is where Severodonetsk and Lysychansk are. So if they pull back, they pretty much have to pull themselves all the way out of the jaws here. So they'll be back around here. Like I said, that's Kramatorsk and Sloviansk and places like that. So that would be one that would basically all of Luhansk Oblast would be within Russian control then, and this would be a sizable chunk of territory that they would be giving up there. And so we'll kind of see what they do with that. As far as dealing with Kharkov back up in the north here. So like I said, they've been conducting some successful counterattacks, but they're still unable to slice into this area here. So this is where the ground lines of communication, i.e. the way that the Russians get to and from their front lines in this area, run right through here. So the Ukrainians thus far have been unable to do any meaningful sort of counterattack there. And, so still, kind of waiting on that. And this is something I've brought up a few times, and it always needs to be restated, is the one thing that's been helping the Ukrainians thus far is, playing on the defensive, their lines are shorter. So like I said, dealing with this is so like if you're the Ukrainians and you have units in this area here, and you need to send them up to Kharkov, over to Severodonetsk, down to Zaporizhia, Melitopol, or whatever, it's relatively a short distance. It's somewhat of a center position. But if you imagine that you're the Russians and you have elements over by Kherson and you wanted to get them, over to Severodonetsk over here, look at how far of a distance that is. They have to go over there, right? So they have to go all the way around, whereas the Ukrainians can kind of just go bam, bam, bump, bump. So, and also being on the defensive, your firepower is massively magnified, because obviously you can set up positions, you can pre-site and register that would be the term that we'd use. You can register targets and things, and so then when the enemy comes out, you can have like on-call artillery stuff for that. And obviously then you can set up things like mines and IEDs and ambushes and stuff like that. Whereas when you're on the attack, now you're dealing with all of those things that are set up. You're leaving your positions that you've prepared, and you're kind of exposing yourself. So you always tend to take more casualties in the attack, at least in the initial portion of it. If you're able to penetrate and paralyze the line and cause kind of a breakdown in defense. So the Russians have always been kind of reckless, but also the Ukrainians have been able to play on the defensive for the most part, which has aided them. So now, if and when they decide to go on some sort of major offensive, major counterattack, which, I mean, at some point, if they're going to want the territory back, they're going to have to. Then they're going to expose themselves to Russian firepower, Russian prepared positions. The Russians still have a lot of artillery, a lot of rocket systems. They still have a lot of air assets and things like that, which I think for the most part have primarily been operating mostly over Russian controlled territory, but they still are there a lot. And so so for them that'll definitely be a risk. So it kind of it's one of those where you wonder what their plan is. Like, what I imagine is that they're in the phase where they're trying to exhaust the Russians. So the Russians have lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,400 tanks. They're basically 3,000 armored vehicles. Hundreds of planes, hundreds of rocket launch systems and other associated vehicles and things like that. So they've basically hit the point where they're unable to make up for those losses with their manufacturing capability, and they don't have on-hand reserves to replace that. So it could be a case where the Ukrainians are essentially trying to basically just wear the Russians out of their equipment as best they can while they acquire more and more equipment before they launch some sort of very legitimate counterattack. So, which I think in a way is smart. I mean, the Russians have been getting material support from Belarus. Belarus has been threatening to invade themselves, which if they did would be very bad for the Ukrainians. Just obviously dealing with now the amount of potential border and territory they'd have to deal with would be like back to the initial days of the war when the Russians were up here as well. But we've seen, and it's been kind of unverified, but there have been videos and reports that the Russians were basically having to transport a bunch of kind of quote unquote antiquated T-62 tanks, to kind of make up for their losses in Ukraine. When obviously they've kind of gone on social media for years and years about they have the T-90M and they have all these fancy T-14 Armata systems and all this or that. It kind of turns out the Russians have enough modern equipment to put on a good show and to do cool videos, but not much more than that as far as actual capabilities. But one thing that needs to be said is they way too often look at tanks that are or vehicles, any equipment of any sort that's quote unquote outdated or obsolete, and they think that means it has no effect, which is untrue. So the T-62 was a very successful tank for its time. Obviously came out in the 60s, and it was largely replaced throughout the 70s and 80s by the T-72 and stuff in Soviet circles. But it's still a big armored vehicle. It's got pretty good frontal armor. It's got a big ass cannon on the front. So if you're using it in like urban operations, fire support, like support of the infantry, perfectly. I mean, it's still very effective. Still very effective weapon. Now, if you're going to talk about meeting an open steppe country against, the Leopard 2 or the M1 Abrams, like, okay, yeah, it's going to be outmatched. But that's kind of just not what's happening. So I think for the things that it needs to be used for, the T-62, I mean, shit, the T-55 for that matter, and all those are perfectly fine, armored vehicles. So just the fact that they're using old models of vehicles, I don't think you can look too much into that because, If you're the infantry, would you rather have nothing or would you rather have a T-62? Providing support to you. That's an obvious answer with that. So sometimes you gotta remember that yes, equipment can be outdated or nowhere near the peak of development for what its type is or what its role is, but it can still be completely effective. So that's something that we do have to keep in mind. When it comes to that. That probably amounts to the major things that we need to talk about. So obviously, guys who are kind of keeping track. So keep an eye on Severodonetsk here, and keep an eye on things down around Kherson here, and see what kind of becomes of that. And then in the next the coming days when more American support and things get there, we'll kind of see what role and what effect the MLRS and the HIMARS system is able to have. And I guess I have heard, one of the Ukrainian channels that I follow said something about that the Israelis might be donating some Iron Dome systems, which for those of you who don't know, so Iron Dome is basically it's an air defense system that the Israelis use to knock down rockets and stuff, that the Palestinians and them shoot at them. So it'll be kind of interesting, to see if that actually comes to fruition. And the Ukrainians have apparently they're sitting at something like 800,000 men under arms right now. So they have a lot of personnel still waiting on better weapons, better equipment. I think we also have to kind of keep in mind that while the Ukrainian videos and stuff are they're fun to watch and it's interesting, and I'm learning a lot about how to use modern weapons paired with older weapons to kind of be effective on the battlefield. Is much of the Ukrainian military is what we would consider, like our National Guard or other such things. And National Guard units, they tend to be the most varied in their performance and capability. So you have National Guard units that are reasonably well trained, have a lot of experience, and then they're probably as good as any other standard quote unquote line outfit out there. And then you have other units that are just all over the place. So of the units that I've worked around when I was in the military and when I was deployed, bar none, the worst unit I was ever around was a Reserve Marine Battalion, and I can only think that it's directly related to the fact that they were a reserve battalion. So it's just they had no individual, no personal discipline, no discipline at the leadership level. They did all the dumbest things. It's like they watched every cliche war movie and then decided to double down on all the dumbest shit that they did. So it's definitely in my kind of my personal opinion is that with those units you tend to have by far the most varied performance on that. So you always have to take a little bit of a grain of salt. Like, oh hey, they have X amount of people. It's like, okay, one, how many of them are professional soldiers? What's the training level of them? What's the equipment level of them? You've seen some of that, especially with the conscripts that were, the Russian conscripts coming out of the separatist areas where they're arming them with M1891/30, Mosin Nagants and some of the old Degtyaryov, DP 28s and what they call it, the dinner plate, the big the World War II machine gun and stuff like that. So a bullet fired from one of those does just as much damage as one fired from an AK-74 or something. However, obviously they are certainly much less effective and much less desirable than other such weapons. So you can kind of keep your eye on things like that. And what you tend to see is that the better equipped the element, typically the more trained they are, but the more likely that they were a professional unit or a unit that existed prior to the conflict is kind of a fairly safe assumption with that. But that's pretty much all that I've got for today. But remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.